War. It's expensive. Every shell, every ship, every uniform, every ration, every boot, every tent, it all has to be paid for somehow. That's the way it's always been. So how do governments pay? There really are only three options. Taxing, which annoys the people you need to fight for you. Printing more money, which will quickly cause inflation if relied on too heavily. And finally, loans. This last one is what most governments rely on. But, of course, to be loaned money, there must be a lender. And the big banks may not always be generous to a government in distress. That is why, around the mid-19th century, governments began experimenting with borrowing money directly from the people. If it was made to sound patriotic, perhaps they could even get their war chest full for cheap. This was the birth of war bonds.
While there's danger all about, you should get your houses wolf-proof. Bricks like these will keep him out.
So what are war bonds anyway? They seem to have made the best posters to ever grace textbooks, and, in retrospect, they seem like quaint relics of a lost form of patriotism. But if you were one of those who actually went to buy a war bond, what could you expect? War bonds are quite similar to any other type of bond. Companies use them, governments use them, and you can buy them today. You are essentially making a very small loan, and as such, you'll lend the receiver a certain amount of money, they pay you interest for it over a certain period of time, and at the end of the term, you get your cash back. The exact details of the bond varied by the government and the war, but let's take German bonds in World War I as an example. German bonds were issued as 10-year bonds at 5% interest, with a semi-annual payment. So, if you bought $100 in bonds, you could receive $2.50 every 6 months for 10 years. And then at the end of the 10 years, you get that $100 back. With all that interest, you'd have made a tidy profit of $50. Just remember that you couldn't spend that $100 for 10 years. War bonds really took off during the First World War. Most major combatants used them as part of a portfolio of financing options, with the British and French generally preferring to mix them with taxes. They also benefited from American finance, where Wall Street barons such as J.P. Morgan had a cozy relationship with the Entente elites and gave them sweetheart deals on loans. The Germans and Austrians, rejected from floating their own Wall Street loan, had to resort to printing extra money. On each side, war bonds made up the difference. How each nation convinced their people to subscribe to war bonds varied. After all, war bonds were not always offered with the best interest rate, and getting paid kind of depended on your government doing well in the war. In Austria-Hungary, school bond drives were held, where children could buy bonds for very small denomination amount. It was kind of similar to those elementary school fundraisers where kids would come around with catalogs, and depending on the amount of little war bonds they bought or sold, they could get prizes. Across the Atlantic, once America got involved, they sold war bonds with pieces of captured enemy equipment, often the famous German spiked Pickelob helmet. Buying a bond let you take home a German souvenir. For their part, in Germany, war bond drives were mixed in with direct donations of different kinds, in the form of giant wooden statues that people could pay to hammer a nail into, giving them a nice sheet of chain nail armor when completed. No matter the flavor, though, in all countries there was an element of peer pressure and societal norms that encouraged people to buy bonds.
We'll win the war, we'll fight for more. Hi-ho, 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 hi-ho. We help to fight the foe. We've done our part with all our heart. Hi-ho, 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 hi-ho.
To give just one example of pressure to buy to the extreme, let us look at America during World War I. Unlike World War II, where many Americans found their involvement in the war pretty straightforward, America was attacked by Japan and declared war on by Germany. In World War I, popular support or even understanding of the war was not always taken for granted. Even today, school textbooks don't really give one concrete answer to why America declared war on Germany in 1917, instead kind of giving a loose list of provocations with Lusitania and the Zimmermann telegram in there somewhere. To compensate for their somewhat vague war goals, patriotic government officials and private citizens alike banded together to remind people at every turn what they thought the war was for. Ideally, by renaming certain everyday items, you could repeat America's war aims at every meal. Sauerkraut became Liberty Cabbage, hamburgers became Liberty Steak, and German measles became Liberty Measles. You might be sick, but you have liberty written all over your face. And of course, war bonds were called Liberty Bonds. Although a lot of these amusing renamings are fun to look at as the overenthusiasm of a few super patriots, some patriotic acts were notably more toxic. American Liberty bonds, honestly, were not a very good investment, and at just 3% interest, they offered half the return that even enemy bonds were offering, and the government had the option to renegotiate the terms at any time, so it wasn't really even that secure. $100 bonds had to be sold at a huge discount of $75 just to get anyone to buy. The hope for those selling these junk bonds was that patriotism would make up the difference between good financial sense and reality. But, unfortunately, this caused super patriots to see those who didn't buy as traitors. A wave of Liberty Bond terror swept America. It wasn't just enough to buy Liberty Bonds. You had to buy as many as a super patriot thought you should be able to afford. If you refused, you could be heckled in the streets at best. But at worst, you could have your house painted yellow to signify your supposed cowardice and find yourself painted with tar and feathers. There were several tarring and featherings across the country recorded, this medieval punishment being revived only 100 years ago. In many cases, the victim was forced to march through the streets singing patriotic songs, and most ending with a perverse ceremony where he had to kiss the American flag to demonstrate his loyalty. And then buy Liberty Bonds. In one instance, an old man who already bought war bonds had his car seized by a mob, who then sold it for a cut-rate deal, and then used that money to buy Liberty Bonds. Religious convictions didn't help either. The pacifistic Mennonites were particularly targeted. Refusing to buy Liberty Bonds that they felt funded an aggressive war, one congregation had its entire cattle herd driven off by super patriots, and again, sold for pennies on the dollar at the market. These were then used to buy Liberty Bonds, but the Mennonites simply refused to accept the bonds when given to them. The Liberty Bonds were left in a bank, unclaimed by anyone. In a precursor to the fear that swept America during the Vietnam War, many Americans fled to Canada in an effort just to get away from their communities who thought they weren't being patriotic enough. For all the terror tactics of these toxic patriots, over the course of the war, Liberty Bond proceeds totaled $21.5 billion. For comparison, World War II war bond sales raised $180 billion, almost 9 times as much. None of the terror tactics being required. Peer pressure and toxic patriotism alone could not force enthusiasm for investing hard-earned cash in an investment with a poor return. But that is only one story of one nation's experience with war bonds. For many other nations, and America in the next war bonds formed a valuable part of the financial portfolio needed to fund an expensive war. But after their heyday in the world wars, war bonds have largely disappeared from investment options. They've been replaced by more standard long-term bonds offered by government, such as in 2023 America, they hover around 2.5%. This trend has actually been broken recently with Russia's renewed invasion of Ukraine in 2022. In it, Ukraine has offered 11% war bonds for sale to fund the defense of their country. It looks like investors have come to expect just a little bit more than patriotic good feelings as a return from buying war bonds.